Number 10. Asch conformity test. The Asch conformity test was conducted in the early 1950s and it showed the human tendency to stick with a mob even though it is clearly wrong. In this experiment, one person, the unknowing subject, was placed in a room full of actors. The conductor of the experiment held up a piece of paper with 3 lines on it and asked for the crowd to identify the longest line. The actors all showed the wrong answer on purpose to see whether the subjects would disagree using their own logic or go with everyone else's answer simply because there is strength in numbers. 37 out of a sample size of 50 chose the incorrect answer even though it was very easy to identify the correct option. This test proved how much people are willing to conform to others' ideas. To this day, psychologists still passionately debate whether this comes from a need to be accepted or from serious issues with self-esteem. Number 9. The marshmallow experiment. Ever heard the expression, patience is bitter, but its fruit is sweet? Yeah, us neither. Till we had to Google it for this video. Irrespective, this experiment proves how this really is the case. Apparently, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a French thinker of the 18th century, was really onto something when he said this. Stanford University members Walter Mischel conducted an experiment in 1972 to test just how true this was. Children aged 4 to 6 were taken into a room and a marshmallow was placed before each one. The administrators then left them alone in a room, and they were told that if they could go for 15 minutes without eating it, then they would get a second one as a reward. Examiners record how long each child could go before succumbing to temptation, and they further record how each child fared later on in life. And the results were surprising. All those who had waited longer before giving in and eating the marshmallow were reported to have a higher success rate in adulthood. A small minority of the 600 children sampled stuff to their faces immediately, but a third of them were able to wait long enough to earn the second marshmallow. In the extensive research conducted over the span of those child's lives, it was found that the children who waited patiently and deferred gratification longer were more likely to do better on their SATs and were more intellectually competent in comparison to their peers. So even though being patient and waiting really is bitter, try to be more mindful of it, and the results in the end are worth it. Number 8. Carlsberg Social Experiment. Carlsberg, a Danish beer brewing company, conducted this social experiment and then turned it into a successful marketing gimmick. They tricked innocent couples at a cinema in Brussels to test how gutsy humans can be when faced with an unfamiliar situation. At the cinema, 148 men dressed as bikers filled the entire stadium, and only 2 seats available were right in the middle. Carlsberg representatives were present to record the exchange that took place. Many of the couples that walked in were shocked to see the crowd, and some of them even responded by saying that this wasn't what they had paid for. Many couples were daunted by the bikers and turned away. Whether this happened, the bikers showed no reaction. However, every time a couple awkwardly shuffled between the bikers and claimed the 2 seats in the middle, everyone broke out in applause and offered the pair a bottle of Carlsberg beer. The reactions of the couples were of genuine shock and pleasure. This is just another experiment to show that humans are creatures of habit and are fearful when approaching the unknown. Number 7. Robbers Cave Experiment. This experiment took place in the summer of 1954. A group of preteen boys were used to see how different groups work together to solve conflicts. Muzaffar and Carolyn Sheriff, as well as their research team at the University of Oklahoma, were responsible for finding 24 boys who were well-adjusted socially and physically in their communities and invited them to a seemingly ordinary summer camp. What these kids didn't know was that the counselors were actually psychologists and they were the unknowing subjects of a psychological experiment. The 2 groups were split randomly and the boys within each group were encouraged to bond with each other. However, the 2 groups were kept apart at all times, and the counselors did little things to reinforce competitiveness between the 2 groups. After instilling competition and some hostility between them, the counselors held tournaments in which the winners were awarded and the losers were made to feel bad. This led to a whole new level of anger and resentment between the groups. Finally, as the last step to this experiment, the psychologists introduced a stimulus that was bad for both groups. The first one was a shortage of water, and surprisingly, they found that the 2 groups were willing to work together to solve the issue. This sparked the curiosity of the psychologists who had set up a few more of these tasks. More stimuli such as lack of food were introduced into the study, which led to even greater cooperation between the groups. By the end of the experiment, they were working comfortably with each other, and all the initial hostility was long forgotten. This study is famous for showing a lot about the human psyche. Many gang movies and even high school sports movies will tell you the same thing. Adversity and combined suffering tends to bring even the worst of enemies closer together. Number 6. The Ape and the Child. Believe it or not, a fair number of human beings have been raised in the wild by animals. Therefore, scientists craved the chance to see if animals could be taught the civilized ways of mankind. In 1931, psychologist Winthrop Kellogg decided to see what would happen if he adopted a 7-month-old female chimpanzee named Gua. The His own son Donald was only 10 months old at the time, and Donald and Gua became fast friends and did everything together. Kellogg took it a step further and even tested their development. Shockingly enough, Gua did better on many of these tests. However, the Kellogg's were disappointed that Gua had not acquired the ability to communicate through words, and they were horrified to discover that Donald's speech cognition was also suffering. When he imitated Gua's hunger bark, the Kellogg's decided that Donald needed to spend more time around other humans. Gua was shipped off to a primate center where she died a year later due to a fever. This experiment is not well known because it is odd to think that humans find it easier to emulate animals than vice versa. There's a real theory out there that cats and dogs tend to act and even behave like their owners over time. There's so much about the human-animal relationship that is wildly fascinating for researchers, and with lack of concrete information, there is much room for growth. Number 5. Beneficial brainwashing. Dr. Cameron believed that the brain could be reprogrammed to be healthier by simply forcing a new pattern of thinking. At the time, he had thought he found a cure for schizophrenia, and he used to force patients to listen to recorded audio messages on a loop for long periods of time. He named this psychic driving, as according to him, the messages were being directly received by the psych, causing the media to dub his approach beneficial brainwashing. From the 1950s to the 1960s, many of Cameron's patients at the Montreal Allen Memorial Clinic became his test subjects, and whether they suffered from schizophrenia or not was not taken into account. Each was injected with barbiturates and forced to listen to different reaffirming mantras such as, "People like you and need you." To check the effectiveness of the program, he once played the instructions to his subjects so that they must pick up a piece of paper. Afterwards, he drove them to a nearby gym, where oddly enough, there was a piece of paper in the middle of the room. He was convinced that his methods were working as all the subjects instantaneously went to grab that one piece of paper. The CIA heard of the good doctor's work and funded his research as they were interested in the findings. Unfortunately for them, their investment did not pay off as he had shut down the experiment. When the subjects later learned of the CIA's involvement, they pressed charges, but the matter was quickly solved out of court for an undisclosed amount. Dr. Ewan Cameron himself admitted later that his research had been a step in the wrong direction, and that it had been focused on the wrong elements. Number 4. A class divided, blue-eyed, brown-eyed. Jane Elliott started this experiment at a local elementary school after Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968. She divided her students into two groups, those with blue eyes and those with brown eyes. The first day, she deemed those with blue eyes a superior group and started giving them preferential treatment during playtime and class time. The changes she noticed within a day were significant, almost instantaneously. The blue-eyed group, armed with their superiority, started doing better academically. Some of them even started bullying the brown-eyed kids, and there was a fight between two boys by the end of the day. Likewise, the brown-eyed kids did not do as well as they normally did academically and fell into the role of being inferiors. The second day, she reversed the roles between the two groups and said that the brown-eyed kids were better. The results again showed the fast effects of negative conditioning. The brown-eyed kids did so much better than they had before, and they returned to being more confident and outgoing. While they were only children, both groups learned the horrible effects of racism, and interestingly enough, when the class came together again at a reunion, each of them remembered the incident and remarked that it made them more conscious of the different challenges that people of diversity faced. Jane Elliott became an advocate for this experience, and she was often asked to give talks to different groups and conduct the experiment with them as well. Her results have always shown that when people are expected to fail, they are more likely to. Undeniably, the perception of others does play an important role in self-development. Number 3. The monster test. This test was called the monster study because of how unethical it was in its nature. However, ironically, this study shows the importance of positive reinforcement for the development of a healthy self. In 1939, Wendell Johnson from the University of Iowa selected 22 orphans and split them randomly into two groups. Each group had a number of children that either stuttered or had some sort of speech impediment. One group was constantly belittled for every single mistake they made, and under the constant chastisement of the psychologist, the children in this group actually worsened. Even more shockingly, the children who had previously not had any speech impediment developed verbal issues after being part of this morally outrageous study. On the other hand, those who were placed in the other group were given positive therapy. Their progress was highlighted and complimented every step of the way. This greatly inspired the massive changes that took place, and many of the orphans developed greater fluency. Even those with stutters were reportedly doing much better in holding conversations. In 2007, several of the orphans who would have been well in their early 70s pressed charges against the study for the lifelong damages they had suffered. as many of them had retained such issues well into their adult life. The courts awarded 6 of these orphan children with $925,000 as compensation for their abuse, which isn't all too much considering many of them were permanently harmed. While it was a harsh and gruesome experiment, many of the reforms in our modern-day education system are based on the findings that support positive reinforcement over criticism. Number 2. Milgram Experiment. The Milgram experiment refers to a series of experiments that were conducted by Yale University Professor Stanley Milgram during the early 60s. This test was conducted soon after one of the Nazis who was put on trial in Israel pled the defense of simply following orders. Since everyone was questioning how much of an effect obedience has on people, Professor Milgram and his team decided to explore the theory of obedience to authority. The experiment asked ordinary people to ask a volunteer who was part of Milgram's team interrogative questions, and then administer shocks through a machine if the volunteer answered incorrectly. The conductor of the experiment took the authoritative role and asked the unknowing subjects to increase the voltage of the shock after each question was incorrectly answered. Luckily, unbeknownst to the shock administrator, the shocks were completely fake, and the volunteer was a hired actor. In order for the test to be truly accurate, the shock administrator was led to believe it was real, and each shock came with a series of horrifying screams from the volunteer. In one case, they even told the subjects that the volunteer had a heart condition, which they expected to awaken the conscience of the subjects. Unfortunately, the results showed something horrifying about human nature. Milgram's team expected the subjects to stop giving the shocks after a certain number, but almost everyone kept going and obeyed the commands of the authority figure without taking into account the morality of their actions. This study makes it to the top of wacky psychological experiments because it shows that there is a little bit of evil within everyone, and that all it takes to emerge is authoritative command. Number 1. Stanford Prison Experiment. This insane experiment was conducted in the early 1970s, and there have been numerous reports and further studies about it. Dr. Philip Zimbardo's ethically questionable experiment even inspired an award-winning movie in 2015. The study was conducted to explore the effects of the prison system on inmates and guards. Both the Navy and the general military were interested in the findings, as at the time they wished to understand the troubled relationship between inmates and guards. Zimbardo and his team enticed 24 males to be part of the study by offering them a pay of $15 per day. These males were further divided into 2 groups, either the guards or the prisoners. Perhaps the freakiest element of the study was that they were chosen for these roles randomly. No certain characteristics could have predicted these decisions. The participants were told to make the simulation as realistic as possible. The prisoners were told to forget they had real names and answer only to their assigned numbers. Their clothes were stripped off them and they were forced to wear uncomfortable prison garb. At the time, the guards were given power symbols such as batons and sunglasses. Soon after the experiment began, the guards became abusive due to the immense power that they had, and the prisoners lost all sense of self and complied with anything that they were told to do. As the study progressed, Zimbardo's team discovered that the guards became more sadistic over time, and seemed to enjoy inflicting pain on their underlings. Within the first few days, 2 of the inmates asked to leave the experiment. One person experienced a mental breakdown, and the other suffered an extreme body rash. Dr. Zimbardo admits that he himself became obsessed with the power that he had as a prison warden, and allowed the abuse to go on until his girlfriend pointed out the ethical issues of the program. The study was meant to go on for 2 weeks, but after just 6 days, the disturbing results forced Zimbardo to terminate the experiment. The results are so morbidly fascinating because they show that normal people are capable of doing terrible things if they are provided with the right environment, as one of the participants perfectly summed it up by saying, "You don't know what you would do unless you were in that situation." If you ever take up psychology in school, you will definitely hear about this experiment. Trust me, I did. Number 10. DeathDate.info. You've probably seen sites or programs that claim to be able to calculate when or how you will die before, but none of them prove to be quite as eerie as DeathDate. Upon first impressions, it's the same as every other